Hello, baking friends. I was thinking that I have a document, a big, long advice for newbies document that is so long that I can't even put it in a comment on Facebook. So, I have this whole big thing. It's pages and pages because, me, I'm verbose. And I thought maybe I would just cover some of these things in a video. I'm sitting on my couch dressed for working out later. I do have makeup on. Ooh. And sorry, I'm just holding the iPad, the video in my hand. I can rest it on my knee. So, the first thing is when you get a new bread machine, the number one thing you should do is read your instructions. No kidding. Don't be that person who just goes. You must read the instructions because every bread machine is different. And even if you've had a bread machine before and you've made bread by hand for years and years and years, every bread machine is different. You load them differently. Some take wet ingredients first, then dry. Some take dry, then wet. Some have a yeast dispenser. I mean, you've really got to read the directions. And the second piece of advice, and it kind of goes along with this, is use the recipe book that came with your machine to get started. I would say make your first 5 or 6 loaves of bread from the recipe book that comes with your machine because those recipes were written to be successful. I mean, it's to me a no-brainer. Okay. Even if you make 5 loaves of white bread, but put cinnamon and raisins in one and put herbs in another and whatever, but use your recipe book. Okay. So, reading your dough. You have to make sure you understand whether your dough, after about 5 minutes of kneading, if it's too wet or too dry. If it's too dry, it could look crumbly, or it could be not coming together into a dough ball. It could look kind of like a rock, like craggy. And in that case, you add a splash of water. I'm going to call it about a tablespoon or about, 8 to 10 grams of liquid, whether it's milk or water or whatever the liquid is that you're using in your bread. Let it knead for another minute and then look at it again. If it's too wet, which honestly, too wet happens to me way more often than too dry, you add more flour. And again, you add a little bit at a time, maybe a tablespoon or about 10 grams of flour, and then you let it mix and then you check it again. Too wet will look floppy and it'll be sticky, so the dough may come off if you touch it with your finger. It puddles under the paddles. That's what too wet looks like. Sorry, I keep having to look at my phone to refresh the list. I'm not distracted. I mean, I am easily distracted, but like the movie Up, squirrel, that's me. I have attention issues for sure. Anyway, I have a video on my YouTube channel that shows you what too wet or too dry looks like. So please take a look at that. You cannot press start and walk away. It is not set it and forget it. Although, once you have made sure the dough is the right consistency, then you pretty much can walk away till it's done. All right. There's a lot of controversy of the paddle holes that are made in the bread. When I was making bread, when I first started using my new bread makers, my Zoes, and I was baking bread, I didn't care about the paddle holes. I don't know why it's a big deal because really, when you slice the bread, they barely make a difference. But that's just me. I mean, I respect your feelings about how you want your bread to look. I know that some people take the paddles out at the end of the last rise before baking and reshape the bread, and then you only have little, these are figures meant to be one of the little poles that hold the paddles. Then you have smaller holes. Hey, if you want to do that, that's you. I don't do it, but it is one of the reasons that I use dough cycle, but a very minor reason. Paddle holes, I don't care really. What I use the dough cycle because I like the shape of my loaf pans better, and I like to be able to egg wash the crust and put toppings on, and I like to have control. I want control. All right, so when you bake in the bread machine and you take the bread out, make sure you have oven mitts. I mean, obviously it's hot. So what I do is I place my hands in the handles kind of upside down so I can turn them over. I know this is weird with my claw-like hands, but able to shake the bread out. Once you've shaken the bread out onto a cutting board or onto a rack, you need to let it cool, and I prefer a cooling rack, a cookie rack. And you need to let it cool for at least 2 to 3 hours before you slice it. That doesn't mean that you can't sneak a slice off the end without ruining your loaf. But if you try to cut all the way through, the whole length of your loaf when it's hot, it'll smush it. You don't want to do that. Okay.
My apologies. I couldn't hear what you said.
Sorry. My Apple Watch decided to activate Siri. All right. If you can't get the loaf of bread out of your bread pan, then take a soft rubber spatula, one that will not scratch the nonstick coating, and just kind of go around the edges, a very skinny spatula. And then you should be able to get it out. If that doesn't work, what you're going to have to do is turn the bolts that are on the bottom of the bread pan, and that should help release it. Okay, what is next? All right, powdered milk. First of all, you never ever have to use powdered milk. I don't use it really. The only reason you would have to use powdered milk is number one, if you don't have liquid milk in the house, or number two, if you want to use a timer and have the bread set to delay to be ready at a certain time. Because milk is perishable, but powdered milk is not. If you have powdered milk and want to use it and use water, fine, do it. No problem. But if you don't want to use powdered milk, you don't have to. You look at the amount of water that the recipe calls for. Let's say it's 290 grams or a cup and a half, whatever it is. Whatever it calls for in water, just use liquid milk and forget the milk powder. Same measurement as whatever the liquid was. It's not rocket science at all. Okay? Again, powdered milk is to have on hand if you don't have liquid milk and you need it for a recipe, or if you want to use a timer. Okay? All right. Here we go. Temperature of bread ingredients. My bread machines have a rest or preheat cycle at the beginning once I press start that lasts, I think, about 25 minutes. That means that I do not have to warm my water, bring my butter to room temperature, leave my eggs out to come to room temperature, or anything like that. Ingredients can go in cold because the machine preheats them. If your machine does not, then you have to warm your milk, soften your butter, leave your eggs out to come to room temperature, and any other cold ingredients. Okay? And in fact, if you haven't bought a bread machine and you're looking for one, to me, the preheat rest cycle is the number one most important feature. I would never buy a bread machine without it because I am too lazy to have to heat water and think ahead and take ingredients out. No way do I ever want to do that. Okay, yeast. There are lots of different kinds of yeast. I only use SAF instant yeast, and also I think bread machine is instant yeast. If you have active dry yeast, use it. I just use the instant yeast because I buy a pound at a time. It lasts for months, and I've had zero fail. So to me, I want to go with my zero fail results. All right. The next thing is oil. Unless unless a recipe calls for olive oil specifically, I would use a neutral oil. I use grapeseed oil. I only have two oils in my house. I have the olive oil and I have grapeseed oil. If you have canola oil, that's fine. If you have vegetable oil, that's fine. I cannot speak to any other oils, but any neutral oil can take the place of grapeseed oil. So if you were making one of my recipes and I say grapeseed oil, you can use canola, vegetable, or any neutral oil. Okay? Butter. Okay, so this is slightly controversial. I grew up, my mom, baked, and my aunt baked, and my grandma baked. And in those days, the only butter that we bought was regular salted butter. So my mom taught me that in a recipe, unless specified, you always use salted butter. A lot of recipes call for unsalted. A lot of recipes just say butter. My go-to is, if it says unsalted, I use unsalted. I keep both on hand. But if it doesn't say, it just says butter, then I use salted. It's never come back as being wrong, and the amount is very small. So if you only buy unsalted butter, maybe just add a pinch extra of salt. I don't know. I did call the King Arthur Baking Company and talk to one of the professional bakers, and they told me that it used to be the way I'm describing, but now the unsalted butter is the default, and the reason they like that for baking is because they have more control over the salt. I'm just telling you what my experience is. If it says butter, I use salted. If it says unsalted, I use unsalted. Okay, what's next? Sugar, 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 sugar. I don't play with the sugar that much. If it calls for sugar, I use basic granulated sugar. If it calls for brown sugar, I use brown sugar. If it calls for honey, I use honey. If it calls for molasses, I use molasses. You can play with it, and you could look up conversions online. Sugar is sugar to a certain extent, although molasses, if you use too much molasses, it gets bitter. So just be careful with molasses. All right. Measuring and weighing. Oh my gosh. So this is a really big subject. I grew up in the United States with measuring cups and measuring spoons. Never weighed ingredients. And for baking cakes and cookies and things like that, it's always worked. I've never had problems, but I know how to measure. When you measure flour and you want to use a measuring cup, you must aerate or fluff your flour. So if you have a big tall canister of flour, you take a scoop or a big spoon and you dig all the way down and you sprinkle it back in, and you dig all the way down, sprinkle back in 5 or 6, 7, 8 times. And then you hold your measuring cup above and you take that original scoop and you sprinkle into the measuring cup until it overflows, and then use a straight edge. If you just scoop into the flour, you will have too much flour. You cannot measure that way. You see people do it, it's wrong. Anyway, but weighing is better. I know that in the beginning people like, why do I need to weigh? I've been measuring with measuring cups for years, and I was one of those people. I mean, I am 64 and a half, and I didn't start weighing my ingredients till 3 years ago. I mean, I didn't know. Once I started weighing, I found out that weighing is, number 1, easier. Number 2, quicker. Number 3, it makes fewer dirty dishes. Number 4, more accurate, and I had better results. So get yourself a scale. Stop rebelling about weighing. And I have a conversion video that you can watch on my YouTube channel. Okay. So, but basically what you do is for each recipe, let's say it's in cups and measuring spoons, you carefully measure the amount, then have an empty bowl on your scale. Make sure it's tared so it's 0 with the bowl on it. Pour that amount in. Note the grams on your recipe. Done. All right. So what is next on my list? Okay. So washing your pan and paddles. I don't know of any bread machines whose pan or paddles are dishwasher safe. Yeah, that would be nice, but not yet. They don't have that, as far as I know. Maybe some companies are starting to do that, but I have not heard of any. So I never get the outside of the bread pan wet. I put the bread pan on its side so it's open, and I hold it with one hand, and then I wash the inside with the other hand, and then I dry it very carefully. So I'm only washing the inside. If there's something on the outside, I kind of wipe it off, but I don't spray water or run that sides or bottom under the faucet. You especially don't want to get water anywhere near the bottom, where the nuts are that hold the paddles on, because that's how I ruined my first bread machine. Don't do that. Do not do that. All right. I never ever would fill my bread pan with the bread pan in the machine. There's too much of a risk of something getting outside the bread pan and going down into the machine where the heating element is. You could not element. You could catch it on fire. You could ruin it. Don't do that. Mine is like across the room. I also know that some people put their bread pan on the scale and measure ingredients right into it. I would never do that, because if you pour too much in, you can't sometimes get it out, especially if it's liquid. I won't take that risk. I measure into bowls first. Okay, what am I looking at next? All right, add-ins like nuts and raisins and stuff. I cannot speak very well to nuts because I'm allergic to nuts, so I don't bake with them. But as far as adding raisins, or seeds, if the seeds are tiny, like caraway seeds, I just put them in at the beginning. If they're bigger, I put them in at the add beep. About the most you can put in is half a cup, although sometimes I cheat and add a bit more. I especially added a lot more with the panettone. And it seemed to be okay, but when my add beep goes off, I do it gradually. Put a little bit in, let it mix, put a little bit in, let it mix, like that. If you're using raisins or currants, toss a little bit of flour into them and coat them really well, and then they won't stick and they will distribute better. Okay, what did I do here? All right, dough cycle. I have a lot of dough cycle videos on this YouTube channel, one dedicated especially to why do we use dough cycle and how do we use dough cycle. Basically, the reason for using dough cycle is, number one, shape. You can shape it however you want. You can use any kind of a loaf pan shape you want. And then number two, it's easier to tell if it's getting done or too brown, because you open up the oven and you look at it and you can put foil over the top if it's getting too brown. Next thing is, I like to egg wash and top with seeds or cinnamon sugar or whatever. I like to put toppings on my egg wash, and doing that in the bread machine, it's not really made to do that. Maybe you could. I'm nervous about brushing egg wash in the bread pan and getting it outside the element, so I would never do that. So if you want to make cinnamon rolls or hamburger buns or dinner rolls, you have to use the dough cycle, because unfortunately the Zojirushi or any other bread machine can only form and bake a loaf of bread. It doesn't make rolls. It doesn't roll out the dough and put it back into bake. That would be something, wouldn't it? Like a robot. All right. I think that is about it. I'm trying to think of other questions people have. We talked about the yeast. We talked about liquids. Oh, you can swap out liquids somewhat. Like, I know that some people can't use dairy and they use almond milk. I personally have never tried, because again, I'm allergic to nuts. I would not have almond milk in my house, but I know you could use oat milk or almond milk. You might have to experiment to see what works, but liquid is liquid. And I'll give you a really weird example. I make challah a lot. And one day I noticed that I had a frozen quart of roast chicken drippings in my freezer. When we make roast chicken, I strain out the drippings and put them in the freezer because they're yummy and they work. You can make rice with them. Oh, the best rice. And one time I thought, could I put that into bread? So I defrosted it and the fat was on the top. I took the fat off and put it in a little bowl. And I defrosted the liquid, the drippings. And in my challah, instead of water, I used the chicken drippings liquid. Oh my God. And instead of oil, I used the fat. And it mixed beautifully. I don't think I had to add flour or liquid or anything. It rose, everything, everything went right. And I formed the challah, and when it came out of the oven, we tasted it and we went out of our minds. It was so yummy. So that was just one example. Now I tried brisket juice from leftover brisket. It was okay. It wasn't as good as the chicken. So keep in mind that you can be a little adventurous and you can swap out types of fat. You could, like, I always have chicken fat, or as we call it, schmaltz, in my freezer because when I make chopped liver or matzo balls or potato kugel, which, are Jewish holiday foods, not just holiday foods, but they're traditional Jewish foods, they all require a little bit of chicken fat. So when I make chicken soup, I take the fat off the top and I stick it in a plastic container in my freezer, and I always have chicken fat. So I could always use that in place of oil or butter in a recipe. So you can experiment a lot, and it's kind of fun. Honestly, I do crazy things. I make brioche that I add candy corn. I know, I'm a candy corn freak. It's a weird thing. It's so good. Sorry, the weather has kicked up my asthma. Anyway, but be adventurous. I mean, I made brioche and I put a bunch of rainbow sprinkles in, and it turned brown and it looked like it was chocolate, and it wasn't chocolate, but otherwise it tasted really delicious. My hairstylist, Lily, loves my sprinkle brioche or my candy corn brioche. I know it's so weird, but be adventurous. That's what baking, it's fun to be adventurous. So I hope I've covered a lot of topics that you might have had questions about. The post I had written is so long I couldn't type it in a comment. Facebook won't let me. It's too long. So here's the video. And I hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, please feel free anytime to message me either through YouTube or through Facebook. You can always message me. I always check for new messages, although I have my sound notifications off so it won't wake me up if I'm, in bed for the night. But anyway, you can always message me. If you've messaged me in the past, I always answer. I always answer. So it's always a pleasure to get to know new people. One more thing, a lot of my bread friends send me friend requests. I try to keep my personal Facebook page personal, people that I actually know. Sometimes over the course of time, bread friends become real friends. I know that some of you will go, yeah, me. But for the most part, I don't accept friend requests because that's my quote unquote actual friends that I know and family members and such. Any recipes or any tips, you're not going to miss anything if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. Every recipe I put on here, every tip I put on here. So you're not going to miss anything. You have nothing to gain by being personal Facebook friends with me, except maybe more zany me. Hey, thanks for watching. Like the video, comment, questions. Give me all you got. I'm happy to always help. And please subscribe to my channel. Thanks, guys.